The M4 Sherman was a medium tank built to win a global industrial war, not a dueling championship on a quiet range. From the moment its prototypes rolled in 1941, the design brief prioritized mobility, reliability, and manufacturability at a scale no army had attempted before. The United States needed a tank that could be produced by the tens of thousands in geographically dispersed plants, shipped across oceans, fed by the same fuel and the same spare parts as trucks and half-tracks, and repaired in muddy fields by 19-year-old mechanics. That set of constraints deliberately rejected the temptation to chase the thickest possible armor or the heaviest possible gun at the cost of all-weather readiness. What emerged was a machine that fit a system. The Sherman as the core of a combined arms team where artillery, engineers, and air power provided the knockout blows, while the tank carried infantry, cracked strong points, exploited breakthroughs, and crucially kept showing up. It is easy, from the vantage of carefully staged photos of long-barreled German tanks, to miss the decisions that made the Sherman what it was. The hull and turret were shaped for volume production, with cast and welded variants that could be adapted to multiple engines. The early 75mm gun was chosen not only for armor penetration, but for its highly effective, high-explosive shell, because most targets a tank met in the field were not enemy tanks but anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and fortified farmhouses. A fast, powered turret traverse let a Sherman swing onto those threats in seconds. Generous internal volume and thoughtful crew ergonomics made it more habitable on a campaign that meant living inside the machine for months. Radios were standard. Visibility for the commander and driver was comparatively good. Tracks and suspension were forgiving of bad roads and worse weather. None of these features made headlines, but together they encouraged a habit that would outlast trendier virtues. Operational tempo. Frontline crews, however, do not fight doctrines or production memos. They fight what is in front of the glacis. When the war moved from North Africa's long sight lines to Normandy's hedgerows, many tankers experienced the Sherman as a vulnerable, high-O-silhouette target. German long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns were murderous from ambush. The first seconds of an engagement often decided who lived to write home. Stories spread faster than technical change. A tank that brewed up once on a French lane became a morality tale retold in every bivouac. The nickname that suggested easy ignition stuck to memory even as ammunition stowage was redesigned and the rate of post-penetration fires fell. A machine can be statistically solid and emotionally resented at the same time. In 1944, to thousands of American tankers, the Sherman felt like an aluminum umbrella in a thunderstorm. Yet the very features that seemed unglamorous kept proving decisive. Maintenance cycles were short because access panels were where harried mechanics expected them to be. The supply chain delivered engines and bogies to depots in a rhythm that an ordnance officer could schedule around. The design responded to combat reports with a speed that built trust over time. Changes such as wet stowage for ammunition, extra armor over weak points, and later the 76mm gun with better anti-armor performance were not theoretical improvements, but fixes rooted in the way the tank was actually used. When units received a batch of new or modified vehicles, they were not learning an alien platform but recognizing a familiar tool sharpened at the right edge. The Sherman's purpose only makes sense inside the American way of fighting the European war. Tanks were one part of a combined arms orchestra whose loudest instruments were artillery and logistics. If a German panzer company sought a set-a-piece duel on favorable ground, the best American answer was, not always to meet it tank for tank, it might be to pin it, walk artillery onto it, and slice its roots with engineers while calling in fighter bombers when the weather broke. That approach demanded a tank that could move quickly, communicate, and survive journeys more than it demanded a tank that could dominate frontal duels at 1,200 meters. In this sense, the Sherman was a doctrine on tracks. It was not the strongest piece on the board, but it had the highest probability of getting to the next square in time. The irony is that endurance can be invisible in the moment. Crews count friends, not readiness rates. They measure survivability by the thickness of the plate between them and the next shot, not by how many vehicles a battalion can generate for tomorrow morning's attack. The Sherman struggled under that kind of scrutiny because its margin of safety depended on a network of factors that only revealed their strength over weeks. The ease with which a seized engine could be swapped, the speed at which a cracked track shoe could be replaced, the certainty that a replacement road wheel would arrive before dusk. A single duel told one story, 100 marches told another. What the Sherman actually was then was not a compromise so much as a vote. It was a vote for a tempo of operations that could be sustained by a democracy turning foundries and car plants into arsenals. It was a vote for a tank that could be taught to rookies, repaired by field shops, and multiplied across continents. It was the predictable heartbeat of American armored divisions, steady enough to underwrite risk, common enough to guarantee spares, and adaptable enough to absorb lessons without stopping the war. To understand why many American tankers hated it early and why their judgment softened as the campaign wore on, we have to hold those two truths together. The Sherman did not protect everyone who sat inside it. It could not. But it kept arriving. It kept starting in the morning. It kept its turret swinging and its radio talking and its tracks churning through mud that swallowed heavier rivals. And because it kept arriving, other arms could do their work, and the sum of the system proved more lethal than the sum of its parts looked on paper. The machine that felt insufficient in an ambush became the machine that made ambushes less common by the simple, crushing pressure of being present, again and again, wherever the fight moved next. As we move forward, the portrait sharpens. The war would test the Sherman in deserts, bocage, towns and river crossings. It would pit it against the most celebrated predators of the armoured world, and through each test, the traits fixed at the drawing board would either fail loudly or, as so often happens with the unflashy virtues, succeed quietly until the map itself had changed. The Sherman's story in combat begins in the dust and glare of North Africa. When American crews first took the M4 to war in 1942, they found a tank that could move day after day without punishing its drivers into mistakes. Its 75mm gun, with a quick-used high-explosive round, knocked out the soft targets that clogged every advance. In a theatre where distances were vast and support lines thin, the ability to keep rolling often mattered more than the comparative virtues of armour slope and gun length. The tank's silhouette looked tall, but in desert fighting that height meant a commander could see, and what he could see he could engage. The first impression, if not love, was respect. Lessons arrived with the Tunisian winter. The German guns were accurate and disciplined. They waited for American tanks to crest and then punched through where armour was thinnest. Maintenance crews learned what would become a ritual. Remove, replace, return to line. The ordnance system back in the United States absorbed reports about ammunition, stowage, and internal layouts, and began planning changes that would flow to Europe far faster than the enemy expected. In Sicily and southern Italy, as the fighting moved into tighter, hillier ground, the importance of communication and coordination became even clearer. Tanks that could talk to infantry saved lives. Tanks that sprinted ahead alone became smoking, lonely lessons. Through these months, the Sherman built a quiet reputation for starting when asked and for being ready when the next mission came. It was not yet a machine to love, but it had proved that it would not strand a crew on a hillside because a final drive was too fragile for a hard climb. In the summer of 1944, the story took a harsher turn in Normandy, where hedgerows turned Europe into a maze of rifle-length lanes and kill zones. Shermans squeezed between walls of earth and roots that funneled them into predictable lines of fire. German tanks and anti-I-tank guns, positioned to watch the openings, waited. The first days after the landings made an indelible mark on American memories. Crews who had expected to fight a mobile war met a defense that forced them to come forward into prepared sight pictures. The tall turret that had been a blessing in the desert turned into a liability under trees and alongside hedges. Tankers adapted with a speed born of necessity. Engineers welded prongs to the front of hulls to carve new cuts through the hedgerows so they could burst where the enemy did not expect them. Infantry and tanks relearned how to move together, every 100 meters an agreed dance. Even so, losses were high, and bitterness toward the machine hardened. That bitterness pushed on a machine already changing. The redesign of ammunition storage, a response to earlier battlefield reports, began to reach units in force. The shift to versions mounting a higher velocity 76mm gun gathered pace, bringing better performance against armored targets, even if crews still valued the older gun's explosive punch against the targets they met most often. Suspension improvements smoothed the ride and reduced breakages that had been accepted as the price of speed. On the periphery of the battlefield, ordnance companies kept up a conversation with the line units that now reads like a masterclass in wartime iteration. What burned yesterday should not burn tomorrow. What cracked last week should be beefed up before next month's push. The autumn that followed revealed the meaning of survivability as something larger than the thickness of steel. When the campaign stretched the length of France and the Low Countries, divisional commanders learned to count on how many tanks would start at dawn, as much as they counted on how many sat there at dusk. Of two battalions with the same paper strength, the one whose vehicles could be repaired overnight was the one that would be present at the bridgehead or the crossroads first thing. Morale bent toward the units that seemed to bounce back. This was survivability in the logistical sense. Not the ability to shrug off a shot, but the ability to reappear with a fresh crew and a rebuilt gearbox 2 mornings later. Winter came, and with it the surprise of a German counteroffensive that sought to tear open the Allied line and drive for the river crossings. For days the weather grounded the air power that American doctrine counted on. Tanks and infantry groped through woods and villages in snow that swallowed tracks and froze oil. In those weeks, the Sherman's habits easy, starting in the cold, generous room for crews wearing too many layers, engines that tolerated less than perfect fuel and oil, added up to a kind of resilience that was hard to photograph but easy to feel. Enemy armor still hit brutally when it found angles. Yet again and again, American units managed to mass enough running machines to blunt attacks and to counterpunch where routes and bridges permitted. The pendulum of sentiment, which had swung so far toward resentment in July, began to tick back as crews noticed that their battalion could field real numbers after a night of frantic work. By the spring of 1945, the geometry of the war had shifted decisively. German armored formations struggled to keep their most feared tanks in motion. Shortages of fuel, spares, and trained mechanics turned impressive machines into burdens that had to be towed, guarded, and abandoned. The Allied advance, by contrast, demanded crossings every day, rapid swings north and south, and a dependable base of vehicles that could climb a muddy ramp, ford a swollen stream, and idle for hours without boiling over. Survivability in this last arc of the campaign meant a tank that stayed in the fight because its ecosystem still existed. Crews who had entered France with a sour taste now watched their vehicles reach the next town again and again and began to speak differently about the machine they inhabited. No single experience erased the early anger or the sharp grief of friends lost to a first-round hit, but the larger pattern became hard to ignore. The tank that so often felt like not enough in a duel had been exactly enough for the war it was asked to help win. The war rewarded presence, and the Sherman, for all its compromises and all its scars, was present with a regularity that ground down resistance ahead of it and left bridges and towns behind it in Allied hands. In that sense, sentiment and survivability converged. The crews did not have to love the machine to recognize that it kept faith with them. It came back from the shop. It rolled at dawn. It survived in the only way a machine can survive in war, by being there when called upon, long after more intimidating rivals had faded into static monuments by the roadside. To understand why the Sherman mattered beyond first impressions, it helps to trace the quiet arithmetic that governed its days. War reduces grand talk to counts and timings. How much time does it take to swap a transmission on wet ground with a crane that barely deserves the name? How far can a tank travel on the fuel stocks a quartermaster can actually deliver across ruined bridges? How many vehicles can a battalion commander depend on not in theory, but when he stands on a chilly morning and looks down a road at the silhouettes forming up. These were the questions that defined whether a plan lived or died. The Sherman was designed from the beginning to make the answers kinder. Cost sat at the foundation of that kindness, and cost here meant more than money. A tank that could be built at scale in multiple plants by a workforce drawn from America's broad industrial base was a tank that could be replaced. Replacement translated into psychological stability as well as operational strength. Units that knew damaged machines would be written off and made good did not hoard their vehicles as jealous treasures. They used them, and that use fed experience back into the system. Alongside cost came the speed of manufacture. When a nation can add hundreds of vehicles a week, surges of losses become weatherable. Commanders can take risks in July that would have paralyzed them in March. The Sherman was a creature of that tempo. Its parts were not bespoke charms, but interchangeable pieces that could be slotted into place by men who had learned the job last month. Readiness numbers, the most unromantic statistics in the Army, tell the story in another register. Operational readiness. How many tanks can move and fire today depends on how often they break and how fast they return. The Sherman's suspension, tracks, and drivetrain were not indestructible, but they were accessible. Crews and mechanics could strip a road wheel, realign a bogie, or replace a thrown track in hours rather than in the dragging, tool-eating days that plagued more complicated systems. Engines came out and went back in with a frequency that would have shocked pre-war planners. The ritual produced a rhythm. If 1/3 of a battalion was down for maintenance tonight, a sizable portion of those would be back tomorrow, and the schedulers would rotate the pain. That rhythm is what allowed headquarters to plan operations measured in weeks rather than spasms of opportunity. Even the mundane question of fuel wrapped itself around the Sherman's fortunes. An army that moves on gasoline and diesel needs trucks more than it needs speeches. Supply officers thought in arcs and throughput, in what could be driven around a cratered bridge and along a forest road at 2 in the morning without dispersing into chaos. The Sherman fit those arcs. Its appetite was significant, every tank's is, but it was predictable, and it aligned with the fuel, filters, and spares that the rest of the force required. Predictability is a form of power. It turns the extraordinary labor of supplying an army into a repeatable act instead of a gamble. It meant that when orders changed, the rolling stock behind the lines could still meet the demand with few surprises. Reliability cannot be reduced to a slogan or a single figure, but crews felt it in their bones. A machine that starts in the cold after a night of sleet is reliable. A machine whose engine coughs back to life after taking on questionable gasoline in a village is reliable. A machine whose turret traverse still responds when grit has found its way into every bearing is reliable. The Sherman earned that reputation not because it never failed, but because it failed in ways that could be fixed quickly. A tank that absorbs abuse and returns from it is a tank that stretches the value of every gallon, every crate of parts, and every hour of sleep the maintenance platoon sacrifices. All of these numbers fed into what matters most, which is the survivability of crews and the staying power of units. Armor thickness and slope matter enormously, and the Sherman's protections often lagged the challenges it met. But survivability in battle can also mean whether the crew can get out when the worst happens, whether a hit ignites all, the propellant at once, or is blunted by better stowage, whether the first aid kit is reachable and the fire extinguisher powerful enough to buy the seconds needed to scramble. As design changes moved through the force, the rate at which penetrations became funerals changed too. It is a cruel calculation, and it was never benign, but it was not static. The tank grew safer for the people inside it as the campaign went on, and the people inside it learned to use terrain, smoke, and combined arms partners to keep themselves out of the most dangerous geometry. There is a temptation in all of this to convert experience into a ratio as if the war were a ledger. The temptation should be resisted. A tank that destroys an enemy vehicle at long range and then throws a track a mile later did not truly win anything if it cannot be present when the column needs a lead element at dusk. A tank that survives a duel but cannot be refueled because its filters and pumps require a different set of supplies than anything else in the corps is a kind of loss that the statistics rarely capture. The Sherman's steadiness across those mundane domains produced value that only appears when one zooms out, the unit, as the relevant organism, not the individual vehicle. In that wider frame, the numbers that matter most are not just kill claims or penetrations resisted, but the daily counts scribbled by staff officers, runners, repairable, cannibalized, written off. Those counts tell us why one machine could be hated and still be the better friend to an army trying to cross countries. The counts tell us why the tank that looked ordinary in the morning became extraordinary by evening after it had carried infantry over a ditch, shrugged through a village under mortars, and parked just in time for the maintenance crew to begin their nocturnal rites. Numbers are not a rebuttal to emotion. They are a second view that explains how a war is actually won. The men who climbed into the Sherman did not reach for doctrine when they heard a shot hit home. They reached for fire extinguishers and for the hatch levers that sometimes stuck no matter how much grease had been applied the night before. To them, hate was not abstract. It was the memory of opening the pistol port to drag a loader into the light. It was the curse that followed a ricochet that had somehow found the only seam in a plate. It was the ache of a long night spent listening to a platoon sergeant count the dead and the wounded and the missing. When those men said the tank was not enough, they meant that they had been asked to drive it into geometry that made survival feel like a coin toss. Normandy made that geometry infamous. In the bocage, the roads were narrow and lined with earth and roots that blocked sight lines and muffled sound. A tank could not swing its turret without betraying its position, and when it edged forward, the muzzle broke the hedgerow first, advertising its arrival to anyone patient enough to wait. German guns were patient. They were sighted to catch exactly that first foot of movement. Crews learned to move with infantry at a distance measured in strides, to use smoke the way they used breath, to punch new cuts through hedges with welded contraptions that turned fields into makeshift gates. Even so, too many first engagements ended quickly and permanently. In that landscape, a high silhouette was not a feature, it was a target. Other grievances were mechanical but rooted in real combat logic. Early ammunition stowage meant that a penetrating hit could set off propellant in a way that left crews no time to escape. The changes that moved that ammunition to safer locations in the hull and protected it with liquid-filled jackets were engineering answers to human screams. They worked, measurably, but they did not erase the memories of the months before they arrived. Nor did they make the tank invulnerable. A crew who had once fought through a fire would forever feel the heat rising at every sharp odor in the turret. The gun, too, was a proxy for fear and frustration. The 75mm round, whose high explosive performance had been a gift in North Africa, seemed like a betrayal when a long-barreled enemy tank punched holes at ranges where the Sherman's armor-piercing rounds struggled to bite. Requests for more penetrating power, for better ammunition, for optics that made distant shots plausible rather than wishful, piled up in after-reaction reports. The arrival of versions mounting a higher E-velocity gun brought some relief, but logistics never delivers perfection on command. Not every unit received what it wanted when it wanted it. Some commanders preferred to keep a mix, preserving the better explosive performance of the older gun for the targets they faced most often, while others pushed for uniformity in the name of simplicity. The men on the receiving end of an ambush could be forgiven for wanting the newest answer yesterday. Training and experience complicated the picture. A tank is only as smart as the team inside it, and wartime armies do not have the luxury of years to mature crews into silent professionals whose gestures mean paragraphs. American units trained hard, but replacements flowed at a speed that constantly diluted hard-won local knowledge. Veteran gunners who knew just how far to lead a target in a crosswind, drivers who felt the onset of a thrown track in their calves before the first metallic clank, commanders who could smell an ambush in the drag of a breeze across a lane. These were assets that could not be crated and shipped. When they were lost, the next day's crew was brave but less efficient, and a less efficient crew inside any tank is a less safe crew. Context also mattered in a way that few crews had the bandwidth to appreciate in the middle of a firefight. The Sherman operated inside a system that expected artillery to answer what the tank could not, and fighter bombers to maul concentrations. That would have been suicidal to approach. When weather grounded aircraft and when radios failed or nets were overloaded, that system sputtered. The tank suddenly stood alone in landscapes designed by the enemy to make it suffer. The fairness of such moments was not the point. The point was that for the men inside the steel, the feeling of abandonment attached itself to the machine they could touch, not to the clouds or the clutter of the ether. They hated the thing that carried them into that loneliness. And yet, even in those bleak judgments, there were times when the crews were right in a way that improved the machine for everyone who followed. Complaints forced redesigns. Anger cut through complacency in depots and offices thousands of miles away. A sergeant's expletive about a hatch hinge could be the first line of a change order. A lieutenant's map marked with X's where tanks had burned could be the exhibit that persuaded a board to reroute ammunition racks and to insist on better fire suppression. The hate was a kind of brutal peer review. It scarred the tank's reputation, but it also carved channels for upgrades to flow. In a peacetime bureaucracy, such emotions might have been wasted. In war, they propelled the machine toward a better version of itself with unusual speed. By the end of the campaign, many of the loudest early grievances had become quieter background noise, not because the men had forgotten their dead, but because the machine had changed and because the context around it had shifted. What the crews wanted most survival into tomorrow had become more likely. The tank still felt tall, and it still felt like too little when a tungsten nuke shot screamed in from a hedgerow. But as the unit's rate of return to the line improved and the reliability of the supporting system hardened, the balance of emotion tipped. The same loader who had once cursed the tank as a death trap might, months later, pat the glacis as he dropped from the hull after a long day and call it by a nickname that, while not affectionate, was no longer venomous. That is not absolution. It is experience aging into perspective. In that perspective, hate and respect are not opposites. They are neighbors separated by time and by the slow realization that a war is not a series of duels, but a procession of mornings when engines must start and tracks must bite. The crews were right to demand more protection, more punch, and more foresight from the people who sent them forward. They were also right, eventually, to recognize that the machine they had resented was the one that kept showing up with them, pulled from a repair bay at midnight by hands just as cold and just as tired as theirs. Their judgment, harsh at first, matured like the tank itself. It did not soften into sentimentality. It hardened into something closer to the truth. The Sherman was not the best tank in every moment, but it was the right tank for the war it helped to finish. American armor did not go to war to reenact a fencing match on an open green. It went to war to move armies, break positions, escort infantry, and turn opportunity into collapse before an enemy could recover. The machine that carried that intent was the Sherman, and the doctrine wrapped around it explained both its strengths and its perceived weaknesses. If one imagined the war as a string of armored duels at long range, the Sherman looked undergunned and underarmored. If one imagined the war as a campaign measured in miles, bridges, and mornings when engines had to start, the Sherman looked like an instrument tuned for the actual music of operations. The American way of fighting hinged on the orchestra of combined arms, where tanks were loud brass but not the entire song. Artillery answered problems that tanks discovered but could not solve in seconds. Engineers tore open obstacles and planted bridges where maps had predicted none. Infantry found the ambushes, cleared the houses, and guarded the armor from the handheld killers who hid behind hedges and stone walls. Air power, when weather allowed, turned concentrations of enemy vehicles into bonfires and salted crossroads so thoroughly that movement by daylight became its own gamble. In that score, the Sherman had jobs that did not always look glamorous from the turret. It pushed into towns behind creeping barrages. It ferried infantry across fields that felt like shooting galleries. It screened flanks and guarded bridges. It sprinted through a gap to turn a retreat into a rout. It called and received fire with radios that, unlike many earlier Tiwa sets, actually worked and were standard across the unit. The tank's fast turret traverse and good commander visibility made it a danger to the small, lethal teams that would otherwise freeze an advance with a single well-placed shot. Those roles shaped preferences. A tank that could move reliably on bad roads, pivot quickly, and stand ready at dawn was more valuable to this method than a tank that impressed in a rare, clean duel but sulked in maintenance bays for days. The division fought as a system. When it did, distances, angles, and hours mattered more than the thickness of a single plate. The Sherman's speed, reliability, and ease of coordination with other arms added up to something doctrine could exploit. It meant a commander could think in terms of sequences rather than gambles. First, smoke, then guns, then movement, then consolidation. The tank was a hinge in that sequence, not a lonely champion seeking a perfect shot. That preference was embedded in organization. Armored divisions paired tank battalions with armored infantry and self-propelled artillery. Reconnaissance troops found routes and bad news early. Engineers followed close with fascines, explosives, and bridging gear. Separate tank destroyer units, controversial in hindsight, existed precisely to answer enemy armor with vehicles optimized for that role. The division fought as a system. When it did, distances, angles, and hours mattered more than the thickness of a single plate. The Sherman's speed, reliability, and ease of coordination with other arms added up to something doctrine could exploit. Doctrine also taught geometry. Terrain that looked inviting for a static duel could be made poisonous by artillery and smoke. Terrain that looked fatal to a frontal push could be flanked with a detour, and a bridge the enemy could not imagine appearing overnight. The Sherman's value lay in changing the conditions of the fight. It did not have to win an unfair contest on an enemy's chosen terms. It had to make new terms by moving quickly, communicating clearly, and letting its partners bite where it could not. A duel refused, a hedge breached at a right angle, a crossroad blinded at the moment of decision. These were victories that piled up without fanfare and reshaped maps. Behind the firing line, the doctrine extended into the rituals of recovery and repair. Damage was not a shame. It was a condition to be reversed. Recovery vehicles dragged hulks back through the dark, and field shops lit them with acetylene ghosts. Because the Sherman welcomed wrenches, its failures turned into returns faster than critics expected. A battalion whose vehicles could be pulled apart and reassembled under canvas was a battalion that could risk more in the daylight. Commanders gambled when they believed the bank would reopen by morning, and the Sherman made that belief rational. The doctrine gave crews habits that kept them alive. They learned to fight with infantry so close that a hand signal could move a squad. They learned to respect the hedgerow that looked harmless in the morning and to cut a new breach rather than poke a nose into a kill zone. They learned to call for smoke without delay and to wait for guns to pound an unseen corner. They learned to back out of bad angles and trade distance for time. These habits, institutionalized in training and repeated under fire, made a kind of armor all their own. Most of all, the doctrine insisted on tempo. A unit that can attack again tomorrow without rebuilding itself from scratch is the unit that eventually dictates the rhythm of the campaign. The Sherman's reliability, fuel commonality, and ease of repair served that tempo as faithfully as any heroism served a single firefight. It turned planning into a craft rather than a prayer. It turned the rumor that an enemy-heavy company had been seen on the ridge into a solvable problem. Pin, blind, flank, call the guns, advance under cover, consolidate, repeat. It turned fear into a checklist and the checklist into progress. The criticism that the Sherman was asked to do too much is fair in the abstract and false in the particular. In practice, units that used it as intended suffered less and did more. The worst days came when circumstances or ignorance forced crews into contests that doctrine would have avoided. The best days came when the machine acted as the hinge around which the rest of the force turned. Measured that way, the tank was doing exactly what it had been built to do: make tomorrow possible in a war that punished the unprepared. Across a meadow at noon with the sun behind you, the Panther looked like the future. Its long 75mm gun promised cruel accuracy at ranges where many opponents were still guessing. Its sloped frontal armor made incoming fire glance away with a hiss that demoralized crews on the wrong end of the exchange. German optics sharpened the world. First contact with that machine left impressions that stained memory, and those impressions traveled ahead of the tank itself like a rumor with teeth. A tank, however, is a traveling compromise. The Panther paid for its menace with fragilities that revealed themselves in use. The final drives did not forgive rough handling, and war is rough handling by definition. The transmission's demands collided with the reality of tired drivers learning on the job. Fuel appetite exceeded what a shrinking logistics system could reliably provide, especially when air attacks turned daylight roads into wreckage. Spare parts existed on paper more readily than in depots, and mechanics who might have tamed the beast found themselves short of time, tools, and shelter. A machine that needed a cocoon entered a world that provided rain and shrapnel instead. The Panther punished bad geometry from the ambush and from prepared positions on high ground. American crews learned to read shadows differently because of it. They learned the sound of that gun and the way the earth seemed to wait before its strike. They learned to call smoke before hope, to ask artillery to rake a line of trees before anyone nosed through a gap. In that sense, the Panther taught its enemies caution, but a weapon that induces caution is not the same as a weapon that decides a campaign. Campaigns are decided by vehicles that keep showing up with fuel in their bellies and crews in their seats, and by staffs who can predict their availability with enough confidence to plan beyond lunch. Complexity magnified the price of every mistake. A heavy machine with close tolerances needed time, heat, tools, and trained hands. The retreat deprived it of each in turn. Field expedients could only do so much. An improved variant arriving in dribs and drabs left units with a patchwork fleet whose quirks multiplied training burdens. The tank's grandeur could not erase the fact that it arrived before its ecosystem matured and then had to survive while that ecosystem shrank. In a peacetime army with stable depots and uninterrupted rail lines, that evolution might have produced a settled, formidable platform. In a wartime army being pushed backward, each improvement had to swim upstream. None of this diminished the fear it caused. Respect is a healthy instinct in a profession that buries pride. American crews learned to spot a silhouette at a glance, and to memorize what ground favored it and what tricks bent its advantage. They learned that mobility, smoke, and the disciplined refusal to accept a bad engagement could pull teeth that looked permanent. They also noticed, day by day, how often fewer Panthers lined up at dawn than had lined up at dusk the evening before, and how many would not roll again without a tow that never came. There was also the matter of recovery. A damaged Panther that slid into a ditch or broke a final drive on a slope demanded a recovery effort disproportionate to its numbers. 2 or 3 vehicles, precious fuel, and hours of exposure might be tied up to move a single hull a short distance. The calculus discouraged commanders from risking them in places that did not promise decisive effect, which quietly ceded initiative to opponents who could afford to bruise and keep moving. Machines that intimidate on paper can immobilize plans when they become immovable in mud. Doctrine on the German side wrestled with this drag. Units that still dreamed in the language of sweeping armored thrusts now found themselves fighting defensively from village to village, conserving fuel, trading ground for time. The Panther could punish incaution spectacularly, but it could not be everywhere. And when it was not present, the defense relied on guns, mines, and infantry who lacked transport. The enemy's system was fracturing. In that environment, the idealized duel that seemed to justify the machine's character gave way to a reality in which days were won by resilience rather than by single strokes. By the last year of the war, the tank's image occupied more space than its operational reality. When it appeared in cohesive formations with fuel and spares, it could still terrorize a plan. Too often, the question in staff tents was not what the machine could do under perfect circumstances. It was whether it would arrive at the crossroads at the appointed hour and whether it would have enough fuel to fight and then withdraw. A weapon that demands care it cannot be given is a weapon that gradually withdraws itself from history. Seen in this light, the Panther explains its opponent by contrast. The virtues that made the Sherman look ordinary: ease of maintenance, tolerance for rough handling, steady appetite that trucks could satisfy, were not footnotes. They were the attributes that turned vehicles into presence and presence into pressure. The Panthers' problem set was not a verdict on engineering. It was a verdict on the mismatch between design ambition and the collapsing context that had to support it. It frightened. It impressed. It broke hearts. It did not, in the end, outlast. War writes its ledgers in time rather than adjectives. A tank that can be counted on tomorrow is worth more than a tank that dazzles today and disappears. Reliability is not a romantic trait, but it is the currency of operations. And the Sherman minted it at a rate that changed outcomes. To see how, imagine a commander assembling a battalion for a dawn, push toward a river line. He does not need legends. He needs runners. If one design yields 50 out of 60 vehicles ready at H hour and another yields 46, the decision he makes about routes, objectives, and reserves changes in a way that cannot be recovered by rhetoric. Availability sits at the core of this arithmetic. It is the quiet percentage that describes how many machines exist as fighting instruments rather than as projects. Availability is a function of how often vehicles fail, how quickly they can be returned to service, and whether the right parts are on hand. The Sherman kept those variables in humane ranges by breaking in ways that exhausted men with basic tools could diagnose, by accepting parts from neighboring hulls without elaborate rituals, and by fitting into a logistics system that treated tanks as heavy members of a broader family rather than as prima donnas. Repair cycle time mattered as much as any thickness of plate. A machine that swallows a day and returns pays for itself several times over in a long week. A machine that swallows a week and returns late might as well be absent from the story that counted. The Sherman's engines, suspensions, and drivetrains were designed with the expectation that field shops would do heavy lifting. Cranes, pits, and pullers traveled with the divisions, and the tank let them work quickly. Mechanics could make gains that modern eyes would call miracles, and that wartime hands called Tuesday. Fuel reliability joined mechanical reliability in this chain. A design that runs on what the trucks already carry extends the reach of every convoy. A design that demands unusual spirits or finicky filtering shortens it. When roads are shattered and bridges provisional, each extra mile is paid for in sweat, steel, and lives. The Sherman's appetite could be met, and met again the next day, without stripping another arm of the army to feed it. That mattered when advances stretched across provinces, when unexpected orders demanded night moves, and when weather stole the help of aircraft. Crew survivability threaded through the numbers like a live wire. A tank that fails safely, that allows its men to escape and offers them another machine to climb into next week, preserves experience. Preserved experience fights better. Veterans read ground with peripheral vision. They hear the difference between normal mechanical chatter and the first hint of trouble. They trim seconds from every drill. Those seconds save lives. Because the Sherman returned enough crews to the fight, units could accumulate these advantages rather than starting over with green men after every bad day. Multiply these traits across a corps, and the campaign map changes. A reliable tank turns the extraordinary act of crossing a river under fire into a procedure. It turns the sudden need to shift divisions laterally by 40 miles overnight into a logistical problem rather than a desperate gamble. It makes it possible to fail today and try again tomorrow without starting from zero. The enemy, facing this persistence, feels pressure that a single brilliant victory cannot relieve. Bridges that fall are replaced, roads that crater are skirted, plans that falter at noon are renewed at 4. The phrase outlived carries weight in this context. It does not mean that an individual Sherman lasted longer in a duel than a fearsome opponent. It means that the population of Shermans remained a living force later into the war, because the machines could be maintained, fed, and crewed. Outlived means that when one formation was exhausted, another with similar equipment and habits could take its place without weeks of retraining or a special flow of spares. Outlived means predictability for planners and despair for enemies who discover that destroying a few vehicles changes nothing about tomorrow's assembly area. Reliability also touched the intangible economics of morale. Men who believed their machines would start and their tools would work carried themselves differently. They planned. They rehearsed. They took prudent risks because they had reason to expect another chance if a plan's first draft failed. That attitude infected staffs and spread sideways to neighboring units. It built a culture in which the safe bet was that an American armored attack, if rebuffed at noon, would reform and return before dusk, with the same core vehicles repaired and the same crews a little wiser. Reliability made ambition practical, and practicality won marches that headlines ignored. In the long roll east, the tank that could be counted on was the quiet cornerstone of a plan repeated until the map changed. The path from a shouted curse to a new part in a crate seems improbable until one watches it happen. The American war machine excelled not only at building in bulk but at listening under fire. The Sherman benefited from that attention with a cadence that turned anger into hardware and ideas into changed behavior on the line. The loop began at the edge of a field with smoke in the air and ended at a depot where mechanics nodded at a label they had been hoping to see. Between those points ran a system of reports, tests, decisions, and shipments that preserved lives by the unglamorous grace of iteration. A report might start with a lieutenant sketching a hedgerow on a torn map and marking where his loader had been burned by a flash he did not expect. It might start with a sergeant who noticed that hatches stuck at the worst moments, or that the stowage of propellant turned small penetrations into roaring fires. It might start with an ordnance officer who tallied the same failure on 3 different vehicles in a week and suspected a pattern. Notes moved upward to battalion and division, where staff turned anger into sentences and sentences into requests. The requests climbed to boards and bureaus that had learned to treat frontline complaints as the most valuable data an army could receive. At testing grounds far from the front, teams reproduced what reports described. Ammunition racks were moved and flooded. Plates were thickened over seams that enemy gunners had learned to search for. Welds were altered, hinges beefed, geometry tweaked. Sometimes the answer was a new variant that would roll off a line in weeks. Sometimes it was a kit that could be bolted on by a field shop with a welder, a jack, and a quiet stretch of road. The Sherman repaid this attention because its architecture welcomed hands. Panels opened where hands reached. Space existed where space was needed. A tank that cooperates with its own improvement improves faster. Distribution was its own art. Crates had to find roads that changed names every village, depots that moved east each fortnight, and units whose positions were promises made at midnight. Quartermasters choreographed arrivals with the intensity of stage managers. When a shipment of wet stowage kits appeared, a battalion's mood changed as if someone had lifted a storm from the forecast. When improved suspension components arrived, a week of complaints about thrown tracks tapered. The loop's success depended on this choreography, and the choreography improved because men could see what it accomplished in the faces of crews who received the parts. Training adapted with the hardware. Manuals grew marginalia. Lectures absorbed fresh cautions. A crew that had never trusted a particular extinguisher learned how to use a better one. A driver who had nursed a fragile component learned to lean harder after an upgrade and make time where he had previously surrendered it. Tactics shifted to exploit the changes. If a kit lowered the risk of catastrophic fire, units dared maneuvers that had felt like wagers against fate. If a better traverse motor made snap shooting more precise, gunners began to take shots they would have passed a month earlier. Factories listened in their own tempo. Production managers who had built cars 2 years before ran lines that produced engines and turrets with a flexibility that surprised even their designers. When a fix was cleared, it did not languish. It propagated. That is not to say there were no delays or fights about priorities when steel and time ran short. There were, and there were hard arguments about whether gunpowder, protection, or mobility deserved the next increment. But the loop had institutional weight. It was expected to run, and people were promoted or replaced based on whether it did. The result of this repetition was cumulative. By the time the war tilted decisively, the Sherman of the spring was not the Sherman of the previous summer. Inside, the differences felt dramatic. a rack in a new place, a lever improved, a hose rerouted, a traverse motor that responded more smoothly, a seat that did not punish the back for hours. Outside, the silhouette did not boast of these changes, and so observers who saw only profiles missed the evolution. Enemies who relied on the memory of last season's weak points discovered that the habit had been outgrown. The loop from field to factory and back again strengthened the social fabric of the army as much as it altered machines. Crews believed that someone was listening. Ordnance believed that its labor mattered to specific men they would never meet. Commanders believed that reporting problems was not an admission of weakness, but a duty that would be rewarded with shipments that made their units stronger. Civilians at home learned to rivet and weld and set tolerances with a care that, they were told, would turn into time and lives saved somewhere they would never see. In a war remembered for its superlatives, humility won more days than hubris. The Sherman's loop of complaint and correction was a humble engine, and it transformed the tank as surely as any thicker plate or longer gun. Where an enemy's complexity became a trap, adaptability became a habit. The machine that crews had entered with a list of curses became, by the end, a vessel for the quiet conviction that tomorrow would be less deadly than yesterday because somewhere, someone had been turning a wrench on their behalf. It kept coming. A war fought in mud and weather also runs on stories, and few machines attracted heavier rumor than the American medium that seemed to be everywhere. The stories followed crews from bivouac to bridgehead, passed in mess lines and at the edge of foxholes where quiet hours invited comparisons. Some stories began in truth and were sharpened by fear. Others were born from a single awful day and gifted a longer life than the day itself. To understand how opinion bent toward contempt and then toward respect, it helps to trace a handful of claims that felt universal at the time and compare them to the war's colder habits. The first was the acid certainty that the tank always burned. The image was sticky because fire is memory's favorite color, and the earliest months on 2 continents provided examples too numerous to ignore. But memory does not count. It narrates. When ammunition stowage moved and liquid jackets arrived, the probability that a penetration became a funeral fell. Crews still hated the weeks before change, but the machine's record was not a single line. It bent, then bent again, and the rumor limped behind, retelling an earlier truth long after the truth had shifted. The second claim that scratched itself into steel was arithmetic, dressed as wisdom. 1 enemy cat equals 5 of ours. Ratios offer the comfort of certainty in a world that denies it. They turn chaos into a chant. The problem is that ratios ignore terrain, surprise, and the difference between an ambush fought in hedgerows and a pursuit fought along a river road. They forget artillery that arrives like an argument from heaven, and they omit the question that mattered most to any staff officer: who will be present for the next attack? A duel measured at noon does not describe a battalion's condition by dusk. When the day's attrition included breakdowns that could not be fixed in the field, a splendid victory in the morning relegated a machine to the night's column of immobile burdens. The chanted numbers never accounted for absence. A third rumor accused the army of refusing better guns out of stubbornness or a cult of adequacy. This, too, rested on real frustrations. Requests for more penetrating power rose from the front with the impatience of men who had seen a long-barreled shape flash at the edge of a lane. But the answer to a demand is not a wish. It is a schedule of steel, machining, freight, training, and doctrine. A turret ring's width is not an opinion. Ammunition supply is not a rumor. The new barrel that arrives without the right propellant, storage, and gunnery tables does not solve a problem. It creates a different one. When upgrades came, they were absorbed into the fabric of a system that had to keep moving while it changed the tires. The work was slower than anger wanted and faster than most wartime bureaucracies have ever managed. Then there was the elegy for the enemy's invulnerable predator. Tales of impenetrable fronts and supernatural optics grew with every silhouette spotted against a tree line at dusk. The fear was sensible. The armor was formidable. The gun was cruel. Yet invulnerable is not the word for a machine whose recovery demands a parade of other machines, whose final drives sulk under stress, and whose fuel appetite collides with convoys that never arrive. The reverence owed to excellence must be balanced by the discipline of context. An army that cannot keep its masterpieces in tune discovers that masterpieces are poor traveling companions. The most persistent rumor of all pretended to be a rebuke of the men who made schedules and moved crates. Victory came only from numbers, not from superior design. The implication was that a lesser machine had been rescued by arithmetic rather than by its own virtues. The trouble with the rumor is that numbers are not a crutch added after the fact. They are the shape of a plan made by adults. Logistics is not a substitute for tactics. It is tactics extended across time. When a machine is designed to accept maintenance, to tolerate rough fuel, to share parts with neighbors, and to be taught to men who learned a farmhand's craft last spring, that design is an ethical position about what a democracy can ask of its citizens and what it can deliver in return. Numbers are not embarrassing in such a framework. They are proof that the framework works. These myths mattered because they trained decisions. If a lieutenant believed the machine would always burn, he might choose a path that saved seconds while courting disaster. If a colonel believed that a duel decided by noon told the day's tale, he might throw units into arenas that did not deserve them. Stories shape the geometry of risk. The counterweight was patient habit. Call smoke before hope, harness artillery, refuse bad fights, move with infantry, recover relentlessly, fix overnight, return at dawn. Rumor lost power when habit won. In the ledger of experience, the tidy moral of a story shrank beside the messy evidence of vehicles that kept showing up. What endures from that contest between storytelling and record is not a scolding for those who believed the wrong thing. It is a caution for anyone who confuses vividness with truth. Fire is vivid. A march is not. A duel is vivid. A week of repairs and short moves in rain is not. Victory, however, prefers the unvivid. It accrues in small decisions repeated until the enemy tires. The rumors never quite died, because no rumor ever does, but they were replaced in action by procedures that cared less about words and more about distances closed, bridges crossed, and engines that still turned after midnight. The story of a campaign hides inside its long arithmetic, but sometimes a few days show the arithmetic at work so plainly that even the most skeptical crew admits what it means. In one such stretch, a corps set its sights on a city tied to the enemy's bridges like beads on a string. The weather closed in, grounding the aircraft that commanders were accustomed to treating as a third hand. That absence should have equalized the duel between opposing vehicles, and on the map it did. On the ground, the distinction between a machine that could be counted on and a machine that required favors became the hinge of the plan. The first day began badly. A company entered a village too quickly and bled on its far edge, learning again the lesson that stone and alleyway conceal not only rifles but careful sights. The medium that led the push took hits where its front was tender, and several crews learned the price of a bad angle. The advance stalled, and the enemy's heavier vehicles prowled like wolves at the margin of visibility. The temptation to accept a set-a-piece duel rose with every minute of frustration. Instead, the division reverted to its less cinematic instincts. Engineers worked through the night to open a path through an orchard that looked like a dead end at dusk. Artillery registered new lanes the moment the batteries could move. Tanks that had limped back on half-broken tracks were torn down and parter-swapped on tarps slick with frost and spilled oil. If one had counted at midnight, the formation looked thin. By dawn, its shape was thicker, not because of miracles, but because a design that let tired hands work had again offered itself to those hands. The second day used the first day's wounds as a map. The tanks did not re-enter the alleys that had punished them. They broke the orchard instead, pushing through trees that shivered against their hulls. Smoke laid a gauze over the opposite hedgerow, thinning but never quite lifting. At the village's far side, the enemy's predators waited for the return of a familiar geometry and were instead presented with a shifting set of half-seen targets. The medium's gunners, who had cursed the day before, now fired at close ranges and into brief opportunities shaped by engineers and guns. The enemy's heavier machines, deprived of their preferred sight lines, hesitated. Two retreated to a road whose shoulders were already too soft and quickly buried themselves to their bellies. Recovery would take more vehicles than the unit could spare, and more hours than the day would grant. The defenders learned the lesson that their opponents had already absorbed. A machine's drama is small beside the boring power of a plan that refuses to feed it the ground it wants. The third day decided the matter. The weather broke only slightly, and the aircraft that made newspapers were kept away by crosswinds that left them impotent at precisely the hour everyone had begged for them. On paper, the day hollowed both forces equally. In reality, one side had repaired enough vehicles to mass where the map demanded, while the other had lost too many to mechanical failures to replace the losses inflicted by combat. The attack did not look like thunder. It looked like the accumulation of small passages, a bridge thrown where the enemy thought the river impossible, a crossroads seized under a blanket of smoke thick enough to make men cough inside their masks, a row of farm buildings converted into an overnight shop that spat out one more runner at 2 in the morning. The tanks that crossed the city line that evening had names from several companies chalked on their hulls, their parts borrowed, and their crews assembled from survivors and replacements who learned each other's voices on the move. They were not perfect machines, they were present, and presence, on that third day, crushed myth. Those 3 days did not erase grief or the rhetorically satisfying sting of comparisons that undervalued the machine's pain. But they taught a garrison of skeptics a lesson that statistics cannot convey without flesh, that a design which accepts repair as its fate becomes a partner in persistence, and persistence wins cities. When orders came to pivot and move laterally along the river to head off a counterattack, the same temperate virtues won the extension. Fuel arrived because fuel had been planned for a machine that drank what the rest of the army drank. Mechanics arrived because maintenance was an assumed river that ran alongside every advance. The last pockets inside the city fell not to heroics, but to the certainty that another push would form before the defenders had finished speaking in the tents of last night. The memory that stuck with the crews who had entered the village on the first day was not of a victorious duel, but of a morning 3 days later, when they recognized their own hulls under new plates and fresh tracks, smelling of paint, oil, and the strange sweetness of survival. They did not forgive the tank its failures. They learned to trust its nature and the system that fed it. That trust changed the way they fought and the way they carried their fear. And because they fought differently, they lived to carry it longer, which is a bleak victory, but a real one. Behind every turret there is a conference table. The path from a crewman's complaint to a crate marked for shipment passes through offices that translate emotion into policy and policy into steel. In a war that forced judgment to keep pace with marching, the institutions charged with building, buying, testing, and altering machines had to make decisions at a tempo that respected the front more than it respected normal procedure. The American system did not always achieve that tempo, but it learned to approximate it, and the learning left fingerprints on every hinge and hose inside the medium that bore the burden of the advance. At the edge closest to the fight, units wrote after-reaction reports with a new candor. Commanders who once might have accepted the machinery of war as fate now spoke with the confidence of men who had seen complaints produce changes. They itemized failures, suggested fixes, and recorded the circumstances under which specific weaknesses had cost them. Those documents flowed to boards whose membership combined engineering discipline with the grain of practical experience brought home by officers rotated from the field. The language of these boards did not flatter. It measured, disassembled, and recomposed. A hinge that bruised knuckles would be redesigned, not because bruised knuckles were an offense to dignity, but because bruised knuckles meant seconds lost at a hatch whose purpose was escape. Procurement offices moved downstream of those boards to translate conclusions into contracts. They bargained with companies that had built automobiles and now built transmissions, turrets, and ideas. The romance of the home front, expressed in posters and parades, could not disguise the grit of scheduling, tooling, and training an industrial base to change without pausing. Lines that had seemed immovable flexed to incorporate new parts and workflows that created room for kits as well as for full vehicles. The decision to prioritize one fix over another set a cascade in motion. A minute saved at a plant could turn into an hour saved at a depot and into a life saved inside a hull. The arithmetic of mercy became a production graph, testing grounds mediated between hope and proof. A solution proposed in a memo was nothing until it had been beaten by sunlight, mud, and the cheerful malice of engineers whose job was to break what soldiers would later have to trust. When solutions survived this abuse, they were certified with a seriousness that gave commanders confidence to plan around them. Certification did not pretend to perfection. It promised predictability. A kit that could be installed in 6 hours by a crew who had never seen it before would be described that way without varnish. The army learned to prefer these honest numbers to optimistic poetry that had once charmed peacetime committees. The calendar hovered over every desk. Decisions that arrived a month late might as well have remained unwritten. The trick was to resist both paralysis and whim. A torrent of complaints could beget change so constant that units never settled. A backlog of requests could leave lives leaking away while someone protected a process. The better offices found a rhythm that matched the front's urgency without indulging the fantasy that anything could be perfect at once. They established triage. This could be solved with a kit immediately. That required the next variant. The third belonged to a distant future when war and memory would trade places and autopsies could finally be calm. Industry responded with the stubborn pride that comes from competence rather than from slogans. Managers who had learned to treat seconds as currency in car production translated that discipline into turrets and engines. When a new part entered the stream, it rarely remained a rarity. The same habits that had made a nation of motorists now made a nation of mechanics who never touched the front and yet nudged it forward by the quality of their tolerances and the patience of their inspectors. The chain did not glorify itself. It got on with the job. The net effect of all this decision-making was not the elimination of mistakes, but their shrinking half-life. Errors were expensive, but they were no longer immortal. The path from realization to remedy shortened as the war lengthened, and crews began to live in expectation that the tank they drove next month would answer the curse they had shouted this week. Institutions earn reputations like people do. The organizations that governed the machine earned one for responsiveness within the constraints of physics and freight. That reputation, born of many small decisions repeated, fed back into the field as trust, and trust is a resource that cannot be issued by supply. It accrues slowly, it spends easily, and it buys time every time a commander chooses a bolder route because he believes the crates will follow. By the last season of the war, roads were crowded with evidence. In ditches lay the hulks of machines that had once seemed to own the ranges at which most men felt like children. On bridges waited the instruments that had been designed not to impress but to persist. The difference, when seen from a staff map, appeared as lines that flowed instead of stuttered, as schedules kept instead of missed, as crossings achieved before a defender organized the respectable ambush that danger always promises. To say that the American medium outlived its rival is not to carve vanity into steel, it is to describe an ecology that endured. Outlived means that a battalion could be rebuilt with familiar parts and familiar drills after a week of savage work, while an enemy unit watched its exquisite vehicle sit leafed in mud, because the coupling that would wake it before dawn was somewhere west of a wrecked rail line. Outlived means that a nation could afford to lose and replace without losing momentum, not because it was indifferent to death, but because it had chosen a design that converted the labor of civilians into hours that mattered at the front. Outlived means that crews who survived walked a few yards to the next hull and recognized the switches, the smell, the logic of the place they would again risk their bones. Continuity is a form of strength, and the machine provided it even when fortune insisted on taking other things away. There is a temptation to reduce this conclusion to a slogan scratched into a monument. That insult would make the machine into a character in an argument about pride. Better to see it as the practical answer to a question the war asked every morning: who will be there at 10, and who will be there again at 4? The medium that irritated its crews with its height and its compromises managed to keep its appointments. The rival that terrified with its first shot too often failed to meet its second. The front notices such things, and so does history, which is just the front written by tired hands later. When the fighting ended and the surviving machines rolled past citizens who had built them, the applause had the sound of recognition. A father who had riveted a seam for 18 months saw the curve of a glacis pass and understood that his body's ache had been converted into a boy's breath somewhere he would never see. A mother who had measured tolerances with a gaze sharpened by grief understood that her care had travelled overseas and returned as a vehicle whose engine did not quit on a hill outside a town with a name she could not pronounce. The tank was not an idol. It was a tested promise. For the men who had learned to resent and then to trust it, the machine left a different trace. It altered how they judged risk and how they spoke to the young. Their stories did not hide the fear or the failures. They praised crews who died and crews who did not. They remembered the smell of hot oil and paint. They laughed at the rituals of maintenance that had once felt like punishments and later felt like prayers. They spoke with more tenderness than they expected to feel about a thing that had not loved them but had carried them and their friends toward an end everyone wanted. They called it stubborn because stubbornness is what persistence feels like from the inside. The field where the last duel was fought did not keep score. Grass grew. The enemy's predatory silhouettes rusted into sculptures that teenagers would climb in peacetime. The medium kept working a few years longer in places where wars do not finish on schedule. It trained new crews, pulled wagons, flattened roads, and served as a reminder that virtue can wear a plain face. Its rivals, built for moments of terror, found their moments gone and their ecosystems with them. Elegance without endurance decays into nostalgia. Utility with endurance hardens into legacy. So when we say that tankers hated the machine and then watched it outlive its hunters, we are not committing a neat rhetorical trick. We are describing a slow change in the hearts of men who learned what keeps a war moving. They came to prefer the machine that accepted repair, the plan that admitted complexity, the doctrine that refused to worship a duel it did not need to fight. They learned that survival is not an event but a habit, and that habits are made of steel only in part. The rest is made of fuel, tools, and the willingness of a society to build the same ordinary thing well enough, and often enough, that the extraordinary cannot stop it. That was the lesson. That is the reason the map changed. That is what outlived really means.